Welcome back. Well, being a single mother is challenging full-time, and it's a full-time job. Well, moreover, being a low-income earner makes it almost impossible. But there are women who somehow make this possible. They juggle their ever-demanding home life with the often overlooked careers while overcoming everyday hurdles posed by patriarchy in society. Well, these mothers are hardly ever celebrated, if at all, and they are domestic workers. Well, today we reveal results of a survey that focuses on pay and living conditions of millions of domestic workers. The study is the first of its kind in South Africa. Sweep South Africa commissioned the survey of more than 500 domestic workers and compiled a report. For more on this, we are joined from our Cape Town studios by Aisha Pandor, the Chief Executive Officer of Sweep South Africa. Very good morning to you. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Firstly, can you tell us who exactly Sweep South Africa is and what do they aim to achieve?
So my company, Sweep South, is an online platform. It's a website and an app that homeowners use to connect to domestic workers. So what we're doing is allowing people to access home cleaning services through vetting domestic workers who come to us being unemployed or underemployed, join our platform, and then are connected through us to homeowners to provide home cleaning services. We work both on demand, so you need someone at relatively short notice, and regularly. So if you need someone 2 or 3 or more times a week, we're able to also provide those services.
In detail, please tell us what the survey reveals about domestic workers in South Africa.
So we performed a survey of around 500 domestic workers across the Western Cape, Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. And we were looking at things like expenses versus pay, and then looking at living conditions, how many dependents people had, financial activities, so whether people were saving, and published the results of the survey in a report. And what we found was quite interesting. So on the one hand, what was encouraging was that across the survey, employers are paying a lot more than the suggested minimum wage for domestic workers. But then when it comes to expenses and what people are spending their money on monthly, and how much of that money is going towards the family, this isn't covered by the minimum wages for domestic workers, even in urban areas. So South Africa has 2 minimum wage levels for domestic workers, one in rural areas, one in urban areas. And even with the urban area domestic minimum wage for domestic workers, which is around 2,600 Rand, our study found that people are paying around 2,900 Rand on basic expenses. So, so those expenses aren't covered by minimums. But what was encouraging, on the other hand, to a degree, is that we saw that averages across the groups that we survey were about 3,800 Rand per month for domestic workers. So while this does cover expenses, we also acknowledge that it is still extremely low, especially considering other data that came from our survey, which is that the majority of domestic workers in South Africa are supporting 3 or more dependents. So, you've got these women who are heading up families, in many cases are single breadwinners, around 70-80% of women, 83% are primary breadwinners, 70% are single moms, and these people are caring for families of 3 or more dependents on 3,000 to 4,000 Rand a month.
Yeah, definitely. Well, the survey has a sample of 500 subjects. How can one extrapolate that millions of domestic workers in South Africa, and how scientific is this study?
So we collected the survey results from both people who were working through our platform, as well as people who had applied to our platform but had never worked on our platform. We're very clear about the fact that, this does represent people who are looking for work in urban areas. So it isn't, for example, a survey amongst domestic workers who are working in rural areas, or even who are actively working in township areas, for example. So I think it's a good start. It's a good sample size. It's spread across people who have worked in different conditions in urban areas. And I think our next steps, and this is something that we intend to publish annually, but our next steps would be to look at representing domestic workers in rural areas and in township locations as well, and then contrasting the data with that. But I think what it does give us is a very good idea of proportional expenses, of living conditions, of family conditions, and I think is also a good first step in conscientizing South Africans to the experience of domestic workers in the country, which is what we aim to do.
Definitely. Apart from those stats and having a look at the financial strain, why did you see the need to conduct this study?
Well, I think there's a lot of current discourse and conversation about minimum wages versus living wages and where we place those minimums. And I think, this is the first kind of study in South Africa that is looking at domestic workers across a wide range in terms of areas and also a wide range in terms of the types of questions that we were asking. And so I think this is important because I think it answers the questions around, firstly, the minimum wage, which part of our recommendations following the study would be that the domestic workers' minimum wage needs to be increased immediately. But the other question is around living wages and what that gap is between minimum wage and living wage. So I think it's addressing very current topics at the moment. And then, as I said earlier, I think it's important also to conscientize South Africans, many of whom employ domestic workers in their homes, to what people are actually spending. And just how difficult it is to make ends meet with the very little that they earn per month.
Yeah, definitely. Every kind of research does have some sort of recommendations that come out of it. What are the recommendations from this research?
So I think the recommendations are increasing domestic workers' minimum wage, as I said. The other things are that if people are able to pay more, they shouldn't be using minimum wage as a guideline or even averages across the areas that we surveyed. I think people should be looking at, for your individual household and using living wages and what people's expenses are as a guideline. That should be used then as how much you're paying. And then I think the other thing is also just looking at, in South Africa, the types of help that we're able to provide people. So, for example, one of the other findings that we found is that only 2% of domestic workers surveyed had medical aid. Now, we know that South Africa has free basic healthcare, and so there are questions there around the level of healthcare provided, and knowing that 98% of domestic workers are using the public healthcare system, is there additional access that we can give or additional level of quality of service that we should be giving to these women and to their families? So I think there's also, in terms of their recommendations, but they're also just realizations that come out of the study that have implications on things like healthcare, on living conditions. So we also found that the majority of people are actually living in apartments and in brick and mortar houses. So obviously having people having free house care is something that works. So I think it also just speaks to South Africa's support of people who are at the lower end income-wise and how effective that is and how effective it can be.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of all the research that you have conducted and what you found, what are the chances of actually engaging with the Department of Labour on your research and some of your findings?
Well, as a new business, so my business is 4 years old, we've always been very open to engaging with government and with NGOs around our research, our findings, and how to use that to improving the condition of domestic workers in the country. And so I think it's a big enough sample to be able to approach the Labour Department and to talk about some of our findings. But I think, for us, what's more important is that we continue to provide studies like this, and we track whether these studies are helping to improve conditions over time.
Definitely. We thank you very much for your time this morning, and if you are a mum, a very happy Mother's Day to you. Well, that was Aisha Pandor, the Chief Executive Officer of Sweep South Africa.